All right, let's kick things off by challenging a really common assumption. When you read the New Testament and you come across the phrase, so that the scripture might be fulfilled, what exactly pops into your head? For a lot of us, the traditional reading goes a little something like this. God inspired prophets, guys like King David, to encode these highly specific, secret predictions about future events into their writings, and they just sat there, waiting to be unlocked centuries later. But is that really how the biblical authors were operating? Were they literally just writing out an encoded checklist of predictions? I want you to keep that question right at the back of your mind.
To figure that out, we really need to look at the very first place our key phrase appears today. This is John chapter 17, verse 12. It's from Jesus' high priestly prayer, right on the night before his crucifixion. He's praying for his disciples, and he specifically mentions Judas Iscariot. He says, "Not one of them was lost except the son of perdition, so that the scripture might be fulfilled." Now zero in on that final clause, so that the scripture might be fulfilled. That right there is the exact grammatical puzzle we are going to dissect today. Because how you read that tiny little connecting phrase, it literally changes everything about how you understand prophecy.
Okay, let's break out the metaphorical chalk for a second and look at the original language. Over in the Greek, the word that gets translated as that or so that in these fulfillment passages is the little particle hina. For a really long time, readers just kind of glossed over how this word functions. But back in 1882, this Methodist theologian named Lorenzo Dal McCabe wrote an absolutely groundbreaking book. He pointed out a massive distinction in how hina operates in the text. And by the way, this is a distinction completely backed up by standard Greek lexicons.
And this brings us to what I think is the crucial aha moment of our entire session. You see, McCabe showed that hina can be read in two distinctly different ways: Telic or Ecbatic. Now, the Telic reading basically means in order that it might be fulfilled. This implies strict prediction, purpose, foreordination, like an event was designed specifically just to match a pre-written checklist. But then there's the Ecbatic reading, which translates more like so that it was fulfilled, or even thus was illustrated. It implies a result, a consequence, a parallel application. The Ecbatic reading suggests that an older scripture proved incredibly apt and applicable to a current lived event. So the focus is entirely on a lived result, not a rigid prediction.
Let's go ahead and test this out. The scripture Jesus references regarding Judas is actually Psalm 41:9, which was written by King David. Now, if we use that Telic reading, we have to believe David was secretly writing about a guy named Judas, who literally wouldn't even exist for another 1,000 years. But if we read the psalm in its actual original context, David is lamenting his own very real, very painful betrayal, likely by his trusted counselor Ahithophel. And this perfectly proves the Ecbatic reading. Jesus isn't decoding some distant fortune teller prediction. He is saying, I have now walked through this exact same experience. He is stepping into and inhabiting Israel's historic experience of intimate betrayal.
So if Jesus is inhabiting this historical pattern, what kind of pattern does Judas represent? Let's transition away from the grammar of fulfillment for a second and look at the dark title itself. In Greek, the phrase Jesus uses is ho huios test apoleis. Literally translated, it means the son of destruction or the son of ruin. But to really truly grasp the weight of this title, we have to understand how the New Testament writers were using the everyday language of their time.
The absolutely crucial point here is that this is a classic Semitic idiom that just got carried over into the Greek. In Hebrew and Aramaic, calling someone a son of something, it wasn't about biological descent at all. It was actually a way to identify their essential nature, their destiny, their deepest character. Think about it. If you were a son of light, you were completely characterized by God's truth. Sons of disobedience were destined for judgment. So being the son of perdition meant that Judas wasn't just, making a terrible mistake. His very identity and his inescapable destiny were completely characterized and entirely owned by ruin.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why the Apostle Paul uses this exact same super rare phrase later on in the New Testament. The only two figures in the entire biblical text given the title Son of Perdition are Judas Iscariot and the end times figure Paul calls the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians. Why them? Because they share the exact same spiritual DNA. Both of these guys were insiders. Both heavily deceived those around them. Both are explicitly described as being empowered by Satan. And both are hurtling toward absolute, total destruction. Paul is showing us a repeating pattern of betrayal from the inside.
But remember, the biblical authors didn't just pull these concepts out of thin air, right? They built them directly upon Old Testament blueprints. You can think of it like a snowball effect of sin and self-exaltation. It starts all the way back in Eden with the serpent. Then it rolls into the arrogant kings of Tyre and Babylon, who literally tried to usurp God's throne. It manifests historically in the tyrant Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple. It becomes incredibly intimate when Judas betrays God in the flesh, and it culminates, finally, in this eschatological figure, the ultimate man of lawlessness.
And we really need to be clear about what Paul means when he says lawlessness. Because in an apocalyptic context, lawlessness is way, way more than just breaking a few rules or jaywalking. It is the absolute, fundamental rejection of God's authority. The defining characteristic of the son of perdition is self-rule and self-exaltation. Just like Antiochus Epiphanes setting up an idol right in the Jewish temple, this figure doesn't just oppose God from the outside. No, he attempts to usurp God's place and sit on the throne himself. And this brings us to a massive theological framework championed by early church fathers like Irenaeus of Lyon, all the way up to modern scholars like N.T. Wright. It's called typological recapitulation. Big fancy term, I know. But recapitulation simply means to sum up. The idea here is that Jesus doesn't just check off a list of Telic predictions. Rather, he actively relives, perfectly embodies, and faithfully completes the entire historical narrative of Israel. Where Adam and Israel repeatedly failed, Christ steps in, acts as their faithful representative, and succeeds.
But here is the chilling counterpoint to all of that. If Christ perfectly sums up all of human faithfulness, well, the son of perdition acts as a dark mirror. He represents an anti-recapitulation. This final figure perfectly gathers up every single historical act of human apostasy, every betrayal, every piece of idolatry, from Cain to Korah to Ahithophel to Judas, into one final entity. And because he embodies the absolute totality of human rebellion, his only possible, hardwired destiny is total apolea, utter destruction.
Just notice the striking contrast here. The Bible is presenting two completely opposing paths. Christ humbles himself. The son of perdition exalts himself. Christ gives life. The son of perdition brings destruction. Christ reveals truth. The son of perdition deceives. As students of this text, we have to realize this isn't just about identifying two historical individuals. No, we are witnessing the ultimate collision of two completely opposing kingdoms.
So class, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. If we step away from viewing biblical prophecy as a rigid, teleologic code of checklist predictions, and instead embrace this Ecbatic, lived historical pattern, does reading fulfilled scripture as Jesus faithfully reliving and completing Israel's story make him bigger or smaller to you? Does it elevate his work to see him carrying the entire weight of history on his shoulders? Take some time and think on that. Class dismissed, and keep seeking the truth in the text.